You've heard of Napoleon, the man who bent Europe to his will, right? But what if I told you that the one battlefield he never conquered was blue, endless, and utterly merciless? Welcome to the Battle of Trafalgar, the moment when Napoleon's imperial dream hit a wall of oak, cannon smoke, and British audacity. This wasn't just a naval clash, it was a wake-up call from the sea itself. A battle where strategy clashed with instinct, where an admiral's final breath carried a nation to victory, and where one colossal mistake unraveled decades of ambition. Most people think history is made with crowns and conquests. But here, history was made with salt water and sacrifice. And the ripple effects? They stretched from the Caribbean to the coasts of Europe, and even to the wild plains of America. So if you're ready to dive into a tale of power, pride, and the storm that swallowed Napoleon's naval hopes whole, stay close. Because what you're about to uncover might just change how you see history forever. Napoleon was a mastermind on land, a general who turned battlefields into chessboards, moving infantry like pawns and artillery like rooks. No one could match him on the continent. His armies marched through Europe like a storm. But while he conquered cities, forts, and empires, there was one thing he could never seize: the sea. And that's where Britain stood tall, unshaken, unsinkable. The British didn't need cannons rolling across cobblestones to show their power. They let their ships do the talking. Napoleon could have 1,000 bayonets. It meant nothing if his enemies controlled the ocean. The truth was simple. Land wins battles, but the sea wins wars. And Britain, with its wind-hardened sailors and iron discipline, had mastered the waves. Trafalgar wasn't just a location, it was a warning. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 didn't come out of nowhere. It was the boiling point of years of tension between Napoleon's continental dominance and Britain's naval supremacy. One ruled the land, the other the waters. It was like watching an unstoppable force meet an immovable object, but with cannon smoke, splinters, and sails. And the irony, this would be the last great naval battle fought entirely under sail. Napoleon, for all his genius, never truly respected the sea. Maybe that was his blind spot. He saw the ocean as an obstacle, not an opponent, but Britain knew better. They had centuries of experience turning tides, literally, and Trafalgar would soon show why the sea listens to no emperor. And while Napoleon plotted invasions from his map-covered chambers, Britain watched with spyglasses from the decks of ships, because something else was brewing across Europe, and the way nations aligned, broke off, or reshaped their allegiances was about to redraw the board once again. When Napoleon crushed Austrian forces at Marengo and Hohenlinden, he didn't just win battles. He rearranged the entire political map of Europe like a deck of cards. Austria, battered and breathless, tapped out, and suddenly Britain found itself alone. But solitude isn't always a weakness. It can also sharpen your focus, especially when your navy controls every wave from Lisbon to the Baltic. Britain had a weapon more powerful than cannons: patience. With every blockade, every intercepted fleet, they chipped away at France's alliances. No one wanted to be on the losing side of the sea. Even powerful nations began to reconsider their positions, wondering if maybe, just maybe, the future didn't belong to France alone. The tides weren't just turning, they were whispering secrets. This wasn't just about ships and soldiers, it was about trust. Who could you rely on when Napoleon changed the rules of war every other month? Britain used its naval dominance not just to fight, but to negotiate, intimidate, and seduce. Ports were closed, trade rerouted, treaties rewritten. It wasn't war, it was chess with salt water. Napoleon could win 10 victories on land and still feel the sting of a single British frigate capturing a convoy. The ocean had its own diplomacy, one of presence, power, and persistence, and Britain wielded it masterfully. Nations once aligned with France now paused, looking toward the horizon. What they saw were British sails, and a future they weren't so sure about. And as Britain cornered the market on naval loyalty, Napoleon looked west, across the Atlantic. There another drama was unfolding, one that would cost him more than ships or alliances. It would cost him an empire in the making. When Napoleon set his sights on reclaiming Haiti, he underestimated the storm waiting for him. This wasn't just a rebellion. It was a revolution of spirit, led by people who had tasted freedom and refused to give it up. French forces arrived expecting surrender and found resistance instead. Disease ravaged their ranks and leadership fell into chaos. Meanwhile, the British circled like sharks, enforcing their blockade with silent precision. Haiti wasn't just a thorn, it was a dagger in Napoleon's side. The dream of a colonial empire in the Americas crumbled before it could take root. And while French soldiers fell to yellow fever, the British Navy made sure no help arrived. It was a chess match played across oceans, and Napoleon had sacrificed his queen. Trafalgar may have loomed in Europe, but the lessons began in the Caribbean. With Haiti lost, Napoleon faced a brutal realization. Holding on to North American territory no longer made sense. Enter the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, he sold vast lands to the United States, exchanging potential for quick gold. It was a short-term fix with long-term consequences. And beneath the signature and handshake, a quiet acknowledgement that sea power once again had dictated the game. The failure in Haiti wasn't just a military defeat, it was a symbolic collapse of Napoleonic ambition overseas. The man who crowned himself emperor couldn't even hold an island, and every ship lost, every outpost surrendered, echoed back to Europe like a warning bell. Napoleon could conquer nations, yes, but when it came to the sea, he was playing on borrowed time. And so, with colonies slipping through his fingers, Napoleon turned inward. Europe would now become his full-time battlefield. But he wasn't done with the sea. Not yet. He had one last idea, a bold plan, risky, audacious, a chance to rewrite the fate that the ocean had so far denied him. Frustrated but never one to fold, Napoleon sketched a new kind of gamble on his war table. If he couldn't beat Britain in open waters, he'd outmaneuver them. His plan, gather his scattered fleets from Toulon, Brest and Cadiz, break through the blockades and unite them for one massive push toward the English Channel. The goal, invade Britain. Bold, absolutely. Delusional, not entirely, if everything worked perfectly. Now this plan wasn't built on certainty. It was built on timing, secrecy, and just a bit of luck. But Napoleon was nothing if not confident. He believed that if the fleets could link up, even Britain's mighty navy might blink. Enter Spain. Their alliance gave France the extra ships it desperately needed. And with that, Admiral Villeneuve stepped onto the stage. His mission? Slip. Past the British and rally the storm. Villeneuve wasn't just dodging ships, he was dodging destiny. His fleet had to dance through a minefield of British eyes and ears, blockades tightening like a noose. Yet somehow, against all odds, he made it out. The Atlantic opened before him like a second chance. Napoleon watched closely, his vision of Trafalgar still unseen, but already rippling in the wind. With Spain's commitment and Villeneuve on the move, it felt for a brief moment like the tides were finally shifting. Napoleon's dream of crossing the Channel no longer seemed impossible. In his mind, Britain was vulnerable, exposed. And if the fleets could come together, the invasion would follow. Trafalgar wasn't just a battle to come. It was a shadow, growing behind every order, every ship. And so Villeneuve set sail for the Caribbean, hoping to stir the British away from Europe and buy time. But the ocean is an unpredictable ally. While Napoleon calculated from his desk, others prepared for battle in salt and sweat. And one man, just one, was already on Villeneuve's trail, ready to change everything. Villeneuve's fleet, like a ghost ship slipping through cracks in a storm, reached the Caribbean. For a heartbeat in history, the French-Spanish alliance held the upper hand. They seized small outposts, disrupted British colonies, and flexed their muscles in unfamiliar waters. But something was missing, something big. There were no decisive victories, no major gains, just the ticking of the clock. Napoleon had expected fireworks. What he got was a flickering candle in the wind. Villeneuve hesitated, unsure of how far to push without support. The British were coming. That much was certain, and the longer he stayed, the louder the footsteps behind him became. Like a man checking over his shoulder in a dark alley, he felt the pressure mounting. Because Nelson wasn't far, and when he came, he wouldn't whisper. Admiral Horatio Nelson wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing fate. Tireless, unrelenting and focused, he pursued Villeneuve across the Atlantic with the patience of a predator, while Napoleon read reports and drew lines on maps. Nelson trusted the winds and his instincts. He knew that if the fleets met again, it would be the moment that tipped the balance. Trafalgar was forming, slowly, silently. Feeling the heat, Villeneuve made the call, return to Europe. He couldn't hold the Caribbean. Supplies were running thin, morale was shaky, and British sails haunted every horizon. His plan, ambitious, as it had been, was unraveling. And so, like a tide that rose too fast, the fleet came back. Only now they were not the hunters, they were the hunted. As Villeneuve sailed toward Europe, he wasn't sailing into safety. He was sailing straight toward destiny. The ocean had given him a brief escape, but now it demanded a reckoning. And off the coast of Cape Finisterre, the first ripples of that reckoning would begin, not with triumph, but with hesitation. Cape Finisterre was supposed to be a turning point, but instead it became a drawn-out shrug. When Villeneuve clashed with British Admiral Calder in July 1805, neither side walked away with a clear win. A few ships were lost, tempers flared, but no decisive blow was dealt. The real damage? Delay. Every hour wasted meant Napoleon's invasion. Plans were slipping like sand through his fingers. Villeneuve needed to reach Brest to complete the grand plan. But after Finisterre, he turned south, not north. It was a decision soaked in doubt, and it threw Napoleon into a fury. The Emperor had dreamed of boots on British soil, of London held hostage by the Grande Armée. Instead, his admiral had blinked, and the English Channel remained untouchable. At the same time, storm clouds gathered on land. The Third Coalition was forming, Austria, Russia, and others regrouping for a fresh punch. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, shifted his gaze from the coast back to the continent. If he couldn't cross the sea, he'd crush his enemies on solid ground. The invasion was shelved. The boats stayed put. Trafalgar crept closer. The delay at Finisterre wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. It exposed hesitation within the French command and shattered the illusion of inevitability. And while Napoleon pivoted to deal with the coalition, the Royal Navy never took its eye off the ball. Britain knew it hadn't won the war yet, but they had just dodged a cannonball. The longer Villeneuve waited, the narrower his options became. And as the Franco-Spanish fleet lingered in Cadiz, battered and uncertain, the sea grew quieter but not safer. Because waiting on the horizon, like a storm building out of sight, was a man with one eye, a sharp mind, and a fleet ready to carve history into the waves. When Nelson arrived to take command off Cadiz, it wasn't with fanfare, it was with focus. This wasn't his first dance with destiny. He knew the stakes, and more importantly, he knew Villeneuve's nerves were cracking. While the French-Spanish fleet stayed huddled in harbor, Nelson's fleet kept its distance, just enough to be menacing. A blockade with just the right amount of pressure. Tight, but tempting. Napoleon had ordered Villeneuve to stay in Cadiz and wait for reinforcements. But what do you do when you're stuck in a port with dwindling morale, angry officers, and a British legend circling you like a hawk? Villeneuve did what anxious people do. He acted. Disobeying orders, he set sail. It wasn't strategy. It was desperation. And that's how Trafalgar found its opening. Nelson, ever the tactician, was ready the moment the fleet moved. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to shatter the enemy. No half measures. This would be a fight for the history books, not just for the day's headlines. Britain's naval dominance wasn't just built on ships, it was built on leaders who weren't afraid to rewrite the rulebook. And Nelson, he was already holding the pen. The ocean turned restless on the morning of October 21st, 1805. The Franco-Spanish ships stretched out in a long line, trying to hold formation. Nelson's fleet, smaller but faster, sailed with purpose, not in a straight line, but in two bold columns. Because when you want to break the enemy's spine, you don't nibble at the edges. You strike straight at the heart. As the fleets drew close, sails taut and nerves tighter, Nelson raised a signal, one that would become legend. England expects that every man will do his duty. And with that, the battle began, not just with gunpowder, but with fire in the soul. And what Nelson did next would forever change naval warfare. Trafalgar wasn't just a clash, it was a masterclass. Nelson didn't follow the usual playbook of naval warfare. Instead of lining up parallel to the enemy, he sliced through their formation like a hot knife. Through butter, two columns, head-on assault. Madness to some, genius to others, he gambled everything on chaos, precision, and British grit. At the front of one column, Nelson led aboard HMS Victory, a ship as legendary as her captain. On the other, his trusted comrade Collingwood charged in with HMS Royal Sovereign. The plan: penetrate the Franco-Spanish line, break it in two, and let every ship fight as an individual predator. It was organized disorder, like a storm choreographed to music. The sea had never seen anything like it. The enemy, spread out and straining to maintain formation, couldn't react fast enough. Villeneuve's fleet found itself tangled, staggered, and stunned. Signal flags flapped wildly but meant little in the smoke and panic. The British poured in like wolves among sheep. Broadsides roared, masts splintered, and men fought not just with guns, but with teeth, fists, and fury. Nelson's innovation wasn't just in strategy, it was in spirit. His officers were empowered to adapt on the fly. No micromanaging, just trust. It was leadership built on belief in his crew, and they didn't let him down. As the French and Spanish ships tried to regroup, they found themselves surrounded, confused, and bleeding into the waves. And at the center of it all, HMS Victory thundered forward. No hesitation, no retreat, just one man at the helm, calm in. The storm, ready to make history. But fate had one more twist prepared, because while Victory approached, so did the shot that would shake a nation to its core. In the thick of chaos, Victory pushed through enemy lines like a lion through brush. French ships Redoutable and Bucentaure closed in, their cannons thundering, their decks ablaze. But Nelson, steady as stone, stood exposed on deck. He refused to hide. "This is no time to be trifling with life," he'd said. And just like that, a French sharpshooter found his mark. The bullet pierced Nelson's shoulder and lodged in his spine. He collapsed, whispering, "They have done for me at last." His men rushed him below deck, desperate to save him, but he knew. Still, he asked for updates, clutching to purpose even as life slipped away. "Take care of poor Lady Hamilton," he murmured. And then, slowly, he faded with the roar of cannons above. While life left his body, Victory roared louder than ever. She had found her mark and laid waste to Bucentaure, flagship of Villeneuve. The French admiral, battered and captured, had to face the irony. His signal flags ignored, his fleet scattered. Meanwhile, Nelson, dying below, learned that the British were winning. His last breath was victory-laced, his death sealed in glory. Nelson didn't just lead a fleet, he inspired a nation. His death hit harder than any cannon. England didn't lose a man that day. They lost a symbol, a living legend who had steered them through storms, both literal and political. Statues would rise, poems would be written, but nothing could match the weight of that moment when the guns fell silent, and so did he. And yet, while the Union Jack wept, the seas roared with new respect. Trafalgar was not just won, it was earned in blood, brilliance, and one final sacrifice. The enemy was shattered, but the true aftermath wasn't measured in bodies or broken ships, it was in what came next. By the time the smoke cleared over the Atlantic, the scale of British victory was staggering. 18 enemy ships captured or sunk. The Franco-Spanish fleet decimated. Villeneuve's signals had been chaotic, ignored or misunderstood. The formation broke down, and with it, Napoleon's naval dreams sank beneath the waves, alongside sails, cannons, and years of planning. Trafalgar wasn't just a tactical triumph, it was a message carved into salt and steel. Napoleon would never again threaten Britain by sea. The Channel, once poised for invasion, now stood guarded by legacy, not just ships. The Royal Navy had proven it wasn't just a force, it was a fortress with sails. And from this point forward, Britain would sail unchallenged for over 100 years. Villeneuve returned to France in disgrace, a man who had seen history turn against him. Napoleon, ever ruthless, had no sympathy. He shifted focus back to Europe's mainland, but a piece of him had died at Trafalgar. Not just because of the loss, but because he knew you can control maps, but you can't control tides. The sea had spoken, and it had chosen its champion. Nelson may have died in battle, but his legacy only grew stronger with each passing tide. Statues rose, ships bore his name. Children learned of his courage before they could write their own. Trafalgar Square wasn't just built to remember a man. It was built to remember a moment where boldness, innovation, and sacrifice redrew the future. And so, as Britain mourned and celebrated all at once, a new era of naval dominance began. Not just with cannonballs, but with confidence. Not just with fleets, but with faith. Because Trafalgar had changed the rules, and when the sea writes the rules, the world listens. But behind every rule, there's always a story waiting to be told. And now that you've walked through the wind and war of Trafalgar, let me ask you something. What dreams are you chasing that demand boldness like Nelson's? What plans are you holding on to that might need a new strategy? One that breaks the mold instead of following it? Because Trafalgar wasn't just about ships, it was about choices, about leaders who dared to lead differently, about enemies who underestimated the sea, about the courage to step forward when everything screams retreat. So, take these lessons with you, apply them to your life, your mission, your battles, and remember, the tides may be unpredictable, but your willpower can be unshakable. If this journey through history sparked something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Click subscribe, tap the bell icon, and stay aboard for more stories that bring the past roaring back to life. There's so much more ahead. And trust me, you won't want to miss a single wave.